Great. I'm just going to start the presentation. Just 1 second. And if any of my group members need another second to get ready, feel free to shout out.
I am ready and I'm starting us off.
Perfect. I love it. All right. Any black boxes or anything? You guys seeing everything okay?
No, it's all
fantastic.
Good.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. Hi, everyone. My fellow group members and I are very excited to speak with you today about our project, which is known as Access to Inclusion, Incorporating Family-Centered Beliefs in the Community. And we really want to emphasize with our title that when we say family-centered, we're talking about both self-advocates and their families throughout the presentation. So go ahead, Kim, you can go to the next slide. Or am I able to? Okay. And so just to outline for our presentation today, we are going to start with talking about the vision for our project. We want to touch briefly on the progress from last year's SEBM group and how we kind of built upon that. We're really going to touch on the family-centered focus and why that's been important to us. Talk about our progress to date, some challenges along the way, and then our next steps and goals for the future. And so I want to start off with this question just to pose it and have you guys consider. You can go ahead and put answers if you want in the chat, but it's really just to spark some thinking about what is the difference between physical accessibility and inclusion. And this question has been very important to us throughout our work with this SEBM project because we really had to consider this. So what is that difference? And physical accessibility is really more about, the ability to reach or enter a site, so we're thinking about things like a wheelchair ramp, or is there steps in the facility, are there automatic doors and things, versus inclusion, it's including that physical accessibility piece, but we're considering even more than that. We are wanting the space to be physically accessible, but also cognitively accessible. And can you, cognitively engage, socially engage in that space and really be a member, an active member in that community space. And then go ahead to the next slide for vision. This kind of leads me to vision, which is that our goal is to transform the greater Cincinnati area so that it's the most accessible and inclusive region in the country for individuals with developmental disabilities and their families. And what we really hope is that we're going to start this model just in the Cincinnati area, but that will be a role model for national settings and allow other cities and cities in all kinds of different states to adapt these inclusion standards as well. And then just to touch briefly on some background legislation, which has been important to consider in our project, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, does have certain accessibility standards that community settings have to have. But despite these standards, a lot of individuals with disabilities and their families still do not feel that these community settings are inclusive, and they don't feel comfortable being active members in these different spaces. And that's because of a lot of things like ableism and racism and sexism, and just this belief that able bodies are superior. Go ahead to the next slide. And Donna's taking it away.
I think you're muted,
Donna.
Donna.
You're on mute.
What, y'all couldn't hear me?
Begin now.
So what was completed last year? Research on inclusion in the community and related legislation, a scorecard for businesses to self-assess level of accessibility inclusion in different areas and help guide plans for working towards inclusion. You can go to the next slide, please. So last year's scorecard, this is an example of one of them. So they included policy, physical accessibility, sensory accessibility, and communication. So each one of these has their own individual scorecard, and it was for emerging, developing, acquiring, refining, and proficient. And then under policy, there would be subcategories that were being graded basically as on the scorecard, which was if there was an accessibility statement, policy communication, staff positions, grievance procedure. Under physical accessibility, there was things that would be graded as parking, accessible doors, ramps, building layout, counter heights. And then under sensory, there was sensory maps. Was there sensory kits or bags? Sensory friendly events and times. And under communication, the scorecard would be accessibility and inclusion, signage, audio, videotape, text alternatives, website accessibility, and simple language. Next slide. So again, we're just putting some thoughts out there for you guys to think about. Drop something in the chat. Do you think ideas of inclusion could differ between families and healthcare professionals? And if so, how? Next slide, please. So with the MCH competency, which is family professional partnerships, last year our team completed the scorecard from a professional standpoint. This year we want to help develop a family standpoint in what should be included in this potential scorecard. So our hope is to edit and adapt the scorecard with feedback from the families. And then I'm going to just go from the competency or MCH competency 8. Part of it does specifically state family professional partnerships at all levels of the system of care ensure the health and well-being of children, including those with special health care needs and their families through respectful family professional collaboration and sharing decision-making. Partnerships with family-run organizations and with families and individuals from the target population honor the strengths, culture, and the expertise that everyone builds on that relationship when engaged in the program, planning, program implementation, and policy activities in leadership roles in a developmentally respectful manner. Next slide, please. So with incorporating benefits, through the research project, we plan to identify barriers to community participation from the perspective of the caregivers, as well as adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, in the greater Cincinnati region. We also want to identify physical and cognitive inaccessibility and lack of knowledge about developmental disabilities and negative attitudes towards individuals with DD. And then also look at identifying and define barriers through a survey distributed to parents of children with disabilities and adults. Sorry, my screen's locked up. And adults with disabilities in the Cincinnati community. Next slide, please. And then my screen is not helping me out here. And then why do you think it's important to get family-centered perspective on inclusion criteria? Again, if you want to drop any thoughts in the chat box, we'd greatly appreciate it. Next slide, please. And then using this information, we will advocate with the family-centered perspective to increase access to inclusion in the community for individuals with DD. And I think I'm now passing on to Angel.
Thanks, Donna. Yeah, so this is our progress to date. Beginning at the beginning of last semester, we started to review the SEBM documents that the previous groups had done. This project's been going for several years. We also had the opportunity to meet with a policy partner, and then we began the IRB draft proposal. And so we didn't have an IRB previously written, and so we are working in the process of writing that right now. We have been brainstorming ideas on how to gather that information from the community and specifically from family members and individuals with disabilities. And then we have began understanding the important topics and formulating questions for a survey that then will be distributed to family members and to individuals with disabilities. And then we also had the opportunity to present at the Family Advisory Council for DDBP and get a lot of feedback from them about what would be helpful to include in this survey in terms of inclusion and access for these family members and also for individuals with disability. So this is our policy partner. The group is called Queen City Certified, and the CEO of this organization is Nicole Armstrong. And I believe that our SEBM has worked with her in previous years as well. We had the opportunity to meet with one of her members of her team. Supal was her name, and their goal at Queen City Certified is equity within the workplace. And so they have a similar type of system in which they score or qualify or certify employers and workplaces based on measures of access and also inclusivity. And so their goal would be to create the most inclusive workplaces possible and have individual employers be certified. And so kind of a similar system, just on a different scale and in a different world, just within occupational health and things like that. And so we had a great conversation with them about where we overlap and ways and tools that we can use in our own project that they have found successful in their work. So the IRB to date, we have had the opportunity to review some previously accepted IRBs with this project, and then the general components of an IRB. And then we had the opportunity all together to draft some of the objectives and then some background information and rationale. I'm working with Dr. Nicole Knighty just in terms of the power and sample size necessary for some of the statistical tests that we're running, because this is a mixed method study, because we will have qualitative data and quantitative data from the survey. And then we need to finalize the creation of the survey before we can submit the IRB. So another step that we have had to go through is considering multiple ways of collecting the information. And so I've kind of hinted already that we're creating a survey. We had kind of floated ideas of maybe doing interviews with family members, or with like the family unit, and then also doing focus groups with individuals. And I think we determined that this survey would probably be the most efficient way and also safest way, considering COVID, to get this information from families, kind of just as a resource, like how can we understand a needs assessment is what I'm trying to say in the community. And so, yeah, we landed on virtual survey. And so as we are currently in the process of formulating this survey, the link will be posted on social media and then also dispersed to the DDP email distribution list. And then respondents from within Greater Cincinnati exclusively will be used, because our goal is Cincinnati and then to be able to expand that more widely. And so we're going to use like kind of the split logic process within REDCap to require individuals to list their county in order to kind of specialize the group and the population that we're working with. And I'm going to pass it to Kim.
So we had one SEBM session where we kind of just brainstormed all the different aspects that we wanted to include from this survey. And it was actually Donna who brought up the really good point of areas in the community can really have different definitions. So we decided that we wanted to have it as different subsections. And the sections we decided to gain information on were restaurants and recreation, places of worship, retail centers, entertainment, and the different ideas that we kind of have listed for under each of those subsections include things like churches, synagogues, salons, barbers, performing arts, the aquarium, museum, and so much more, because a lot of people define community in a lot of different ways. So we are planning to use REDCap, as Angel has suggested. It is an online forum that can help us collect and compile data. We do plan to look into how REDCap can be a little bit more accessible to all individuals, and that is a future thing that we want to do. We are hoping to have our verbiage be at a no higher level than a 7th grade reading level, so that it is accessible to all readers. And we want to make sure that the completion time should be 20 minutes or less, so that participants don't get frustrated with the survey, or perhaps only do part of the survey and then exit before finishing it entirely. We also are hoping to ask respondents specifics about their family and child with disabilities, such as demographic info, relationship to the child with disabilities, if they are the child, if they are the parent, or some other form of a family member. We also are going to have lists of the type of disability that they identify with, including multiple aspects of disabilities such as autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, developmental coordination disorder, and many more. And we'll also have a box that they can select that say other, where they can specify if they don't feel like their idea is listed, and also their mobility level. So if they have to ambulate with an assisted device, or if they are independent in ambulation, we also think that would be helpful for the physical standpoint. Finally, as Angel mentioned before, we are hoping to obtain qualitative. So that is more the descriptive information, such as quality, and quantitative data. So that is more the numeric data, as I like to remember quantity when we're considering these results. For the quantitative data, we're going to have a sliding scale of how satisfied they are between various locations and types of community and how inclusive they are. And then under each sliding scale, we're going to ask them to describe what aspects make it inclusive and why they are satisfied or dissatisfied. And now.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about our meeting with the Family Advisory Council that Angel talked about earlier today. And it kind of went back to that idea of inclusion and how that may look different from health professionals than with caregivers or family members. So we really wanted to make sure with this virtual survey that we are including the voices of the community that we're doing this needs assessment for and with. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to get feedback on beliefs of inclusion and other opinions and suggestions that the FAC meeting was able to provide for us. So there we just presented our project goals and some of the things that we were working through. So for our meeting, we had a total of 4 questions. We didn't want it to be too overwhelming because we only had 45 minutes, and we also wanted to provide time for meaningful discussion and conversations. So the first 2 questions that we asked was about accessibility and how communities feel inclusive to the individuals and their families, and then the opposite. So what doesn't feel accessible or not inclusive. And some of the themes that came up were some things that felt accessible were the sensory-friendly events that happen around Cincinnati. And something very interesting that was brought up was having Target having bigger carts than other stores because a family member had an individual who's 13, so a little bigger, but Target's able to accommodate that. And then on the other end of the spectrum of inaccessibility, the stores, so not having carts that are able to fit their child, as well as the mall not having carts. It's something that didn't really cross my mind until a family member said that and made a really good point. Something else that was mentioned was during these sensory-friendly events is having time for our families having time to ask questions prior to arriving so that they can feel a little more prepared when they get there. And parking, accessible parking was another theme that came up. Thanks, Kim. So then these were the last 2 questions that we asked. So the third one had multiple parts, but we wanted to know about specific venues that families have tried to attend, but weren't able to because it was inaccessible. And we just wanted to engage in conversation about what would you change? What were some extra resources that you think would improve your experience? And also, what would you wish the staff would know about you and your family, which was a favorite question of mine. And then lastly, we wanted to know if there was something that we were missing or did not address that you think would also be important and accessible for them. And some of the themes that came up was theaters and malls aren't as accessible as they can be. Malls, pretty interesting, like the music being too loud in the stores and how that can affect their families. Parking, especially for like sporting events around the city, that was another theme. Restaurants having more picture items and not being as wordy would be helpful as well. And then in terms for what did you wish the staff knew about you, a lot of families mentioned how they don't want people to be judgmental and that neurodiversity is common and should be accepted in these communities, and that language is very important. So even if a child has a physical disability or a cognitive disability, they can still understand body language and can get those negative perspectives from people who are within the community that aren't as accepting. And then something else that they thought was, sorry, Kim, but something else that they thought was important to address was also that universal design and just having human decency and respect for others. So some of the challenges that we had so far were kind of already mentioned, but I'll try to briefly go through it. One of them was transitioning from exclusively focusing on caregivers, but now we're including individuals with developmental disabilities who are in their adulthood. And then we also received a lot of information from the Family Advisory Council, as well as prior information from the previous years, and just making sure that we're capturing all of those opinions and feedback to make sure that it's family-centered and accessible. As mentioned, we had to push back our IRB, but that is research that's gonna happen. So that's something that we're working through currently. And then along with that, we also realized that analyzing and summarizing the data may not be possible during our timeline. We're definitely going to try our best, but it may be something that another group will have to do in the next year. And then also just COVID-related stress and fatigue. There's a lot going on in the world. We're all just trying to hang in there. So that's definitely an element that cannot be ignored and had to be acknowledged as well.
All right, and I'll go ahead and finish up with just some next steps. What are we looking forward to doing in the future? So the first, of course, is just to create that survey that we discussed, and we're using the information from the FAAC meeting to help us do that. We plan to, of course, submit our IRB for approval. We plan to collect the data from the families regarding what they want in these community areas in order to get their opinions on what is inclusive. Of course, summarize that data, and then we're going to incorporate all of that data into the previously made scorecards. So if time allows, it's likely that this will probably be some future goals for next year's SCBM group as well. All right, and so then lastly, just we want to kind of summarize everything up for you with the goal of our project is to really just address the differences between the physical accessibility points and inclusion within our community, and really focus on having that family-centered input. We want to make sure that we have the input from people who are experiencing this lack of inclusion firsthand. And then we are hoping to just start this within the greater Cincinnati region, but would love to become a model so that we can encourage other communities to adopt these really important inclusive standards as well. So that's our wonderful project in a nutshell. Thank you guys so much for listening. Do you have any questions?
This is Karen Burkett. I think this was a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much, team. It was very informative. It was also seamless in how you presented, one right after the other, and it flowed very nicely. I really appreciate that. I did have a question on how you developed the questions. I thought they were very poignant, to the point, and broad enough to get the wonderful feedback you got from the FAC. How did you go about developing those questions for the FAC?
I mean, I think it was a group effort. Yeah, we started with probably a list of like 8 questions, and then kind of expanded on a few that felt like they were capturing like the main points that we wanted to get, which was really just opening it up and allowing for families to talk about what mattered to them. I think our whole perspective is that we want families to get a voice in places that they haven't been given one. And so that was the goal going into the FAC, just to learn. And I feel like they had incredible feedback for us. It was really great.
I think they did too. What's incredible is how your group created the environment where families could feel like what they said mattered. Nice work.
I do have a quick question about why you guys chose to collect data on the county instead of the zip code. Just curious about that, since I especially think about Warren County and Hamilton County being so broad. So it could be just a consideration to think about collecting zip code as well, depending on how many surveys you're anticipating. But I'm just curious as to why you guys decided on county.
I don't know if I know the answer to that question, team. Did we? I mean, it's a good thing to consider for sure.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Weber. I think we were trying to restrict it to our region, but open it up. But that is something that we could do with the zip code instead.
Jason?
Go ahead, Jason.
So I'm curious, you said that one of the issues that you're sort of seeing is interviewing adults, getting participation from adults with disabilities, if I remember right. What is it that is sort of the issues you're having now, and what are you sort of hoping with design it, the way that you would design it, that you would be able to sort of hopefully mitigate that to some extent?
So that's a really great question, Jason. It was more of just like an issue of, at first we were just thinking about doing it from a family perspective. And then as we were going through the project, we kind of decided that it would also be really important to include the individual themselves in the feedback that we get, the data that we gathered. And it was more of the issue of how are we going to change our survey, and how will it affect the way we analyze our data, having both viewpoints, if that makes sense. And
Yeah, so
my
it sounds
team
like
member
that
can,
are
sorry,
you-
what, Jason?
Sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to
No, you're
cut you
fine.
off with your other teammates. So, I mean, is that meaning that, because I know sometimes people have it where people do it as a whole family, how would that be? Is it because sometimes you can get different survey results based on if you're doing it with the person themselves answering it or with their family members? I know I answered things differently when my parents are in the room, not because they're bad or anything. Sometimes they have stronger opinions or different opinions, or it's different than just my thoughts, because all of our thoughts influence each other in some ways.
I mean, that's a
Yeah.
really good point. Like, for instance, if someone said that they were the individual filling it out, but if it's the parent filling it out for them based on what they're saying, it could change their perspective. So that's a really good thought. And sorry, Caroline, I think I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say our team thought long and hard about this and actually made a pros and cons list, and ended up just thinking that combining the two versus making separate surveys for self-advocates versus, family members would just ultimately really expedite the process and get us this really important information that we needed to move forward with this project. So that was our ultimate conclusion, but it took a lot of thought for sure.
Yeah, and Jason, I just want to add in here too that a lot of this was based on kind of feedback that we got from you during our initial presentation because we were going to do this year with just the families and next year with the individuals, but we were like, nope, we're going to do it now.
And I know Andrea has her hand up, but we are over time for the questions and the presentation. So Andrea, if you can hang on to your question, and if we can circle back later if we have time, that would be awesome. Or put it in the chat box and then the ladies can answer. Oh, no worries, Jason. No, you're fine. And the next group is Lisa's, I believe. So thank you, Jen and Kara's team. Great work. Awesome. Keep it up. And then
All right, I will.
You're going to share. Okay.